Hello and welcome to another screencast, this time in the social and cultural factors for the post-industrial era. So we're looking here at around about 1850. So what does the syllabus require us to know? Ideally, we need to be aware of the key characteristics in regards to the industrial era. We need to be aware of their impacts on sport during this era, and ultimately we need to be aware of the social and cultural factors and how that had an impact on participation in sport overall. So your first task, you can see a diagram here, and this is from the post-industrial era. So I want you to pause the video here, and I want you to just describe as many words as possible, as many adjectives as possible. How would you describe this picture? Okay, so hopefully you come up with some keywords in regards to describing this picture. So you can see there, you may have written down the word, for example, smoky. It's built up area, so it would have been crowded, would have been heavily industrialized at this period of time. Okay, so we had lots of mills, lots of factories that would have been building and producing lots of goods and products during this period. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution itself, so ultimately what do we need to know about it? So it happened roughly between the 1850s and to the 1900s, and ultimately it was this idea of creation of cities, the growth of cities, and ultimately as these towns and as these cities grew, okay, people were attracted to it because of the working prospects in regards to working in factories and obviously earning some money, and ultimately these particular towns and cities would often lack space. They'd be crowded, there'd be lots of smoke, lots of smog, okay, and ultimately they were tough conditions to live in, but they were the central, the hub of living, and that's why they obviously attracted so many people to them. And ultimately, it was this introduction during this era of the middle class, so the factory owners who would have been part of that middle class network. And as well as that, you can see sort of in the picture that we've got this rapid development of transport. So things like the steam train, for example, would have had a huge impact in regards to sporting development, as we'll see. Okay, so sport, or the changes in the types of sport. So ultimately here, what we need to know about, first and foremost, is this word codification. So during this era, we had the formulating of written and recorded rules. So ultimately, sport started to have a set of rules attached to it, so each individual sport. And ultimately, during the course of this era, we also had limited space, which meant if we had limited space, it meant we put time restrictions on these activities. We had confined spaces, so ultimately we started to have the setup of pitches, and also we had the regulation of things like team sizes. So again, pause your video here and just think about these three sports in particular in regards to football, animal baiting events, and lastly rugby, and how did it change during this era? Okay, so from here we can look at first and foremost football, and initially in the pre-industrial era we had mob football, but that changed over time. So during this era we started to create what we called association football, and the national governing body, the FA, the Football Association, was created in 1863. We also had a bigger demand here for spectatorism. That's the amount of people watching the event, and ultimately that was due to the fact that we had an improvement in transport. As well as that, if we look at then the animal baiting events, we had a decline of this ultimately, because obviously, as we'll see in a few minutes' time, the changes of law and order, and ultimately certain pursuits were cancelled and some were protected. So it was interesting, wasn't it? The upper class pursuits, so things like shooting, fox hunting, were protected because ultimately those in law and order would have been upper class people at that particular time, but activities in sports such as, for example, boxing and other underground events would have been cancelled. And then finally, sort of looking at rugby in particular, and we're going to be looking at the public schools and their influence in a later lesson. But ultimately, we had this idea of professionalism. We're going to look at what that word professionalism means. But we had a divide between the South and the North. And ultimately, the factory workers that were clocking in and out of their shifts, they would have been given broken time payments. Okay, so if they missed a Saturday of work to play in a particular fixture, they'd have been reimbursed. They'd have been given money back to play that sport. And the Southerners didn't agree with this. People in London, for example, they believed in the amateur traditions, so playing for the love of the game rather than for money itself. And ultimately, this actually then divided and created a split within rugby. So we had the Rugby League being created in 1895, as it says there. Okay, so first and foremost, we do need to know what amateurism and professionalism means. So these two definitions are really important. So by an amateur, we're looking at this idea of playing sport for the love of the game. There's no monetary reward. It's this idea of being a traditional gentleman. Okay, so within cricket, this would have been an example in terms of batting in cricket. It was seen as a bit more of a leisure pursuit, leisure activity, whereas the hard work was in the bowling element. Okay, that was a lot of the legwork, wasn't it? So professional athletes, okay, were those that were paid for money, as we know today in terms of sport today. And obviously that increased the things like the winning aspects, making it more important, and ultimately more competitive. Okay, so let's look at the social and cultural factors, and we're going to whiz through these now. But ultimately, in terms of the social class, first and foremost, we started to have this, not just the lower class and the upper class, we had the middle class as well. Ultimately, as I said before, things like mob football were outlawed, fox hunting remained, but as it says there, the lower classes sometimes had the odd occasion, or more than the occasion, should I say, became professionals, and we're going to look as to why that was. There was a bigger demand for it. And the middle and upper classes, they kind of remained amateur. They had their money, they had their wealth, okay, so they didn't need to be paid to play. And we had things like the Saturday half day, so whereby factory workers and factory teams would participate in work until around about midday, and then ultimately after that they were given time to play sport. And this, I've got here a diagram of the English game. It's really worth watching. It's a 6-part episode series, and really worth watching in terms of how sport developed, and in particular football. And then, as it says there, however, working class still had a lot of less access to sport, as we'll see shortly. Okay, so let's move on to gender. So gender, remember in the pre-industrial revolution, were given very little time and little space, and often had to be confined to home. And all this, although this still happened, there was growing equality in regards to education, work, and their voters' rights. So they were starting to fight back. So I want you to pause the video here and think about what were the impacts of these kind of gender protests on sport. Okay, so some impacts you may have mentioned would be things like that. There was obviously a gradual increase in participation, and this obviously started with PE, which was created towards the 1900s. Okay, we had state school education PE. Ultimately, there was still low participation in females in comparison to males. Okay, so let's move on to law and order. So we had the development of the police force in 1829, and we also had other things being formed, the RSPCA, for example. But often a lot of these laws and these establishments would have been created by the upper and middle classes. So ultimately, just pause the video there again and think about what are the impacts of these law enforcements on sport. Okay, so things you could have thought about and mentioned. Obviously, we've got a decline of violent sports, a decline of animal baiting, and ultimately we then had more control in regards to gambling. So a lot of these events were in the pre-industrial era were then brought underground because they would have at this stage been illegal. Obviously, it says limited changes in cruel activities for the upper class, as they were basically the lawmakers, weren't they? Okay, and codifications, this idea of rules and formulating rules brought about in regards to a variety of sports. If we look next at the availability of time, so remember in the pre-industrial era, we had workers working for 75 hours per week. We had a slight reduction in that in terms of them only now working for 57 hours. Still a long period of time, isn't it? But it was a reduction, and ultimately that half Saturday in particular created obviously workers' factory teams. Again, pause the video here. What was the impacts of these new time restrictions on sport? Okay, so the workers themselves, they obviously occasionally would riot in regards to wages and so on. And ultimately, this ensured that these new kind of timeframes helped, the growth of participation. But it was, again, still slightly reduced, wasn't it? Because obviously they're working so much. But as they only worked half Saturday, for example, they may have had more energy to participate, and it created this kind of morale. It created this camaraderie of them coming together, working as a team, and ultimately that increased these developments of these factory teams. Still, they had less time, didn't they, in comparison to the upper class ultimately. In terms of availability of money, so again, the working conditions were still poor. They were working for long periods of time, these lower class factory workers, and they obviously had no paid holidays for the working class, but they did start to get professional contracts. Again, pause the video here. What's the impacts of these new things in terms of professional contracts? Okay, so the impacts on sport, working class still, it says lacked disposable income, so they couldn't obviously access certain equipment still. So obviously things like real tennis would have been a struggle for them to participate and competing. Ultimately, with these stated professional contracts, we did have an increase in the access to some money, and ultimately this enabled obviously some factory workers move and change work places so that they could obviously join different teams. So we started to see this idea of, for example, a transfer, didn't we, in regards from not only from one factory worker place to another, but ultimately in terms of playing for different teams. Look at the next cultural and social factor in terms of transport. Obviously, we had a big development here in regards to transport, that we had the growth of railways in particular. The conditions of roads started to improve and get better. Again, pause the video here. What's the impact now of these transport developments on sport? Okay, so remember in pre-industrial we had localized fixtures, but now we had the possibility of national and even international fixtures, and ultimately this helped create things like leagues, cups being set up. Okay, so it wasn't just played now in our local area, we were now able to travel to different parts of the country, and that's how, for example, the Football Association, the FA, set up the FA Cup. We also had increased opportunities to play in different sports, okay, because obviously we were able to travel to those specific facilities, and it also helped the development of standardized rules. So the establishment of the 1863 Football Association helped to ensure that everyone was playing by the same rules rather than in the past as it was before, where we had localized rules. Now we had standardized, codified rules. We move on to education and literacy. So again, here we can see sort of the upper class tended to attend public schools, private education, but state education being developed in the 1870s had a big impact in regards to the working class for both females and males. Again, just pause the video here. What's the impact on sport of this? Okay, so things you could have mentioned, we've got obviously an increase access to the range of the working class now being educated, they're able to understand rules, able to read and write, and that obviously increased things like participation through physical education, through exercise. Okay, just to finish with, in terms of this lesson, 2 exam station questions for you. So 1, looking at outlining the key characteristics and differences between pre and post industrial sport. So that question is looking at your AO1 knowledge there in particular. Okay, so just outlining what are the key characteristics between both eras. And then question 2, a little bit more difficult now. So again, showing a bit of AO2 in particular, where you're using some sporting examples. Okay, as it says there, sport and society changed significantly between the 1700s and 1850s. Using sporting examples, explain why these changes took place. Okay, so if you need to look back at the video, feel free to look back at the video again to help you. Okay, if that question's a little bit longer, asking a bit of AO2 application and your knowledge as well. Good luck in this task, folks.